Good evening and welcome to my channel. Tonight we'll be reading Miracles by Sinclair. The news that Marcian was back in Latium was at first not believed by many, but nevertheless it spread quickly as such stories tended to do. This was not surprising. Marcian, often called Marcian the Prophet, but more often Marcian the Cursed, or Marcian the Doomsayer, was known throughout the Republic. From the southern marches in the territory of the Greek degenerates to the far north where the new settlements in the Po Valley sat uneasily near the Gaul savages. The stories were as familiar as they were disquieting. People were surprised that he would dare to come so near the city. Rumor ran rampant, one of these being that his own family had said they would have him killed if he ever came back to Rome. Another that he had come to foretell some awful catastrophe. As the stories spread, people began to report omens. In one of the villages, a baby was said to have been born with all his teeth. People said that one night the moon had turned green. It was reported that statues were weeping tears of blood. Streams were seen running uphill. Nobody was surprised by these, but they were surprised when yet another rumor began. Namely, that Lucius Pomponia, one of the richest men in Casinum, wanted to meet the notorious seer. Some people who believed the story said that this was what happened if someone had too much good fortune, that it had to be paid for, and that evidently Lucius was going mad. They, however, were very much the minority, as Pomponia was very well liked. Most who did hear the story also hoped it wasn't true, for the same reason, Lucius Pomponia being considered a fine man. If the Latium region produced the best wine in Italy, then most people in the Latium town of Casinum agreed that the best of the best wine came from Lucius Pomponia's estate. It was truly excellent. For many years after, old people would say, "These wines are fine, but they can't be compared to the stuff Pomponia used to make." That was what you call wine, especially the real stuff, the reds. Those were the good old days. Not the same quality to anything now. Perhaps this could have led to jealousy, but it didn't. Not only was Pomponia rich, but he was also generous and fair-dealing. He was not even that rapacious about buying out the smaller peasants, a process that was sadly starting in those days. Then there had been the drought. It had struck the region with savage heat for 2 years. Not only did the crops wither and animals die, but people were also in danger from dying of thirst. It was at this time that, as if by magic, the spring had been found on his land. Its waters were icy and copious. He opened it up to everyone. Even though the head of one of the oldest patrician families, he got his hands dirty and helped to get the water to people. Men were proper men in those days, the old people would sometimes say. People agreed that he had saved the day. The death and loss that inevitably did result served to rather reinforce the point. Without him, it would have been much worse. They also remembered when a merchant from Naples, who sold the chalk and marble dust, used to make the wine less acidic, had nearly cheated many of them. The man had offered very good prices. People were going to buy. But Pomponia had rubbed some of the powder between finger and thumb and announced, "This cur is trying to do us. Dog's been sifting." It turned out the man had indeed been washing sand and putting the fine stuff in the mix to make it go further. The practice was known to give people the flux. A big patrician estate might have survived something like that, but the loss of reputation would have destroyed some of his neighbors. The dishonest merchant had been put in a sack with a mad dog and thrown in the river. Lucius was also fine company when he sat over his wine. He was said not only to have prodigious capacity, but to also be that rarest of animals, a happy drunk. When well into the jar, he could tell stories that made people weep with enjoyable sentimentality or split their sides with laughter. He could even tell tales about his time in the legions. He was a veteran fighter in the north and make them interesting. Prior Privately, people said he was a vast improvement on his father, of the same name, who, although a military tribune twice, and therefore a credit to the region, had been a difficult, dull, tight-fisted man. It also didn't hurt that his son took after his mother, Cornelia, who when in life was said to have been a beauty. It was late one day, just after the first of the good wine made from the free-flowing juice of the grapes was ready. This was the fine wine, not that made from the second pressings. Lucius had just been sampling it in the cool of the atrium. He thought it might be the best they'd ever made. Sometimes his good fortune secretly worried him. In common with his countrymen, he privately believed it would have to be paid for. This was why he wanted to talk to Marcian. Always a direct man, he believed it was better to take the bull by the horns. He knew the man's brothers and uncle slightly from his time in the city. Lucius, fair-minded man that he was, half suspected that he would be disappointed. He thought lots of the fuss was probably the plebes enjoying the delightfully scandalous fact of someone from an old patrician family going mad and imagining himself a soothsayer. No more than that. He could also afford to be a bit condescendingly kind to one of his own class. As far as he knew, there were no blood ties between the Julie and his own gens. Besides, his family was much more important, although he modestly reminded himself not on mother's side. His grandfather had only been a member of the equestrian order, and by all accounts a cantankerous old rogue. His oldest house slave, Felix, appeared. "The man has been seen, master. One of the field hands saw him on the Via Latina north of the town. The man knew it was him because the mob had driven him from Casinum. He told me some of them were still throwing stones." Lucius had a thoughtful sip of his wine. "You already have your instructions. See to it, Felix." Felix hesitatingly said, "I would advise against this course, master, if I may." Felix was an educated man. He managed the estate's accounts. Furthermore, not only was he another asset of Pomponia's that people said he was fortunate in, but it was to Felix that Lucius had first taught her to in infancy. His master trusted him completely. "Don't be an old woman about this, Felix, but your instructions also include the precautions you yourself have insisted on." Kindly, Lucius said, "And I know you have my, Antonia, and the children's interests at heart. You and I will meet the man here alone." Felix bowed and withdrew. Lucius had some more wine and went to stand by the door so he could watch the track down to the road. Unconsciously, he touched the household altar by the doorway. Felix returned to the atrium about 2 hours later. "I have met the man, master, at the 3rd milestone south. I did as you instructed. Told him he is invited up to the villa this evening, that he is to come at early twilight, that he may make use of the bathhouse and then be received by yourself, but only if he does not have one of his compulsions to speak about any of the living family or household other than yourself." "Did you give him the food and the little amphora, as I instructed?" asked Lucius. "Yes, master, and I told him that if he felt unable to come, that he could refresh himself and rest just within the fields, that before he moved on again, we would get him more to eat." Felix hesitated and then went on. "When I passed him the bundle, the man wept. He said, 'Please thank my cousin Lucius for his kindness.' He is not what I expected, master. The man is in a pitiable condition." Lucius raised his eyebrows. "That was a strange thing for him to say. As far as I know, there are no blood ties between his family and mine. Unusual enough in old ones like ours for him to surely already know that." Felix stood silent, his face grave. "Well," said Lucius, "do I have to ask?" "Marcian Caesar says he will come." Felix showed Marcian in. Lucian had been shocked in more ways than one. The man was very small and horribly thin. At least he was now washed and properly clothed. When he had come up the hill, he'd been clad in rags and filthy. Marcian had turned and bowed to the household altar like a normal person, showing better manners than some Lucius could think of by not actually touching it. The man looked round nervously. From the shadowed alcove where he discreetly watched, Pomponia saw a face that in some ways reminded him of the man's family. Like them, he had the same high, broad forehead, the same hooked nose. The man was, of course, balding. Sometimes the Caesars were called by unkind wits the hairy men for this fact. There, however, the resemblance ended. Marcian had a curious pointed chin. The mouth above it seemed too wide for his face. It looked to be made for expressive grinning and smiling, but trembled now with anxiety and fatigue. The most startling thing about him was, of course, his eyes. These were huge and unlike his brothers and uncles, set far apart. They were a startling green color. Pomponia knew that his old boyhood Greek tutor would have condemned the use of an expression like eyes that had seen too much as a cheap device of poor rhetoric. He need not have worried. The impression Marcian's eyes had on Lucius Pomponia was one of washed-out dilution. The vivid green color was there, but somehow there was no strength behind to it. It couldn't travel beyond them. What the eyes had seen had washed its strength away. The impression was not that of a madman, nor a devil from Hades. It was that of a child's favorite uncle, the one they could run to when they were naughty, who for some inexplicable reason been cast out on the road. Lucius came into the light of the lamps and gave his most charming smile. "Greetings, my dear Caesar. Welcome to my home. I am sorry to find you in difficulties. You will refresh yourself with some wine?" On being greeted in this way, and especially at the use of his family name, the man's mouth broke out in a grin. It was sunny and glad, but then it was gone. He glanced round nervously again. His mouth trembled. "Gratitude, Pomponia, but I must tell you I have a sending for you. Although it concerns only yourself and some of your people who have already passed over the river, I would not wish to abuse your kindness. Only although it does not touch upon your future, as such it might offend." Kindly Lucius reassured him, led him to a couch. Felix poured them both cups of the best new wine, then retreated into the background. As the story unfolded, he was apparently impassive. Only at times his master felt him tense, as we can sometimes read the smallest reactions of those we have known all our lives. Afterwards, to his dying day, Felix never said a word about it. Marcian began. "Your maternal grandfather, Molo Augustus, also made wine, but as you know, being a knight on a much smaller scale. As you'll also know, his estate lay only a mile south of the city. Old Molo was a bad-tempered and difficult man. He was madly proud and possessive about all that was his, and as likely to take offense as feel slighted over matters as a successful freedman. He was consistent in this regarding his 6 beautiful daughters. He was the first man in the district to give his girls their own first names, rather than patronymic or family ones. Some found this both shocking and laughably pretentious, but not to old Molo's face. He was a formidable man with the strength of a bull. Nothing would do but his girls marry only into senatorial families. This also made people laugh at him behind his back. It also annoyed them. They said he was a social climber. Woe betides to the young men in the district if they looked at the girls sideways. It happened one year at the time the grapes were to be pressed that the crop was extraordinarily fine. A great vintage was expected to result. Molo was a bit of an old misery. As you know, nothing is thought to go well at the pressing of the grapes without music and merrymaking. Lucius nodded sagely. He knew this. People said it even affected the taste, just as he knew half the girls ended up pregnant at the end of the pressing. So every year Molo was forced, despite himself, to get some singers and players in. A short time before, a young wandering lyre player and singer had come into the district. People said he was the best. All the girls were in love with his handsome face and form, his insolent eyes. Molo didn't want to lose face, so he hired him. He immediately suspected he'd be trouble, but he could not confine the girls to the villa all the time. Nor could he be on the lookout every moment at the busiest season of the year. He was walking back from one of the countless errands when he heard noises behind one of the barns, the noise of a happy man and woman, and he recognized one of the voices. He caught the singer with one of his daughters. She ran off at top speed. Molo began to beat the young man with a stake from one of the vines, but the young man plucked it from his hands with ease. His eyes turned to red pools, exactly the color of fine red wine, and the dead vines he wore in his hair became living plants, married and disappearing into his scalp, and he grew huge without seeming to get taller. It was the Lord God Bacchus. "You have begrudged me a taste of your crop. I deny you mine," Bacchus said. And so, when they poured out the new wine a month later, it was water. They could see the good wine in the jars, but it turned to water in the cups. Molo even had the slaves hold the amphorias up and pour it into open mouths. It turned to water. Water. Molo went mad. He sold the slaves off cheap, told no one, and smashed and burned the barns. Silence in the atrium. In the background, Felix thunderously silent. Slowly, Lucius asked, "Marcian, do I need to ask the name of the daughter?" He managed to keep his voice level. Hesitatingly, the prophet answered in a quiet voice. She ran off to the city, to her mother's people. They hid her at a neighbor. There she met and married the tribune, who fell in love with her quickly. People said she had a glow about her. "And I was a 7th-month child," said Lucius. In the same quiet voice, Marcian answered, "So you see I was correct to call you cousin." Lucius Pomponia was never again afraid of his good fortune. Marcian left the villa with a purse of gold. However, Marcian did not go far, although people were cunningly led to believe he had. Pomponia had a small farm high up in the back country. Here the soothsayer found a haven. He was supplied with everything he needed, and at the turning of that year, long, long ago, he began to write. Thus ends Miracles by Stephen Sinclair.